On this episode of the Barricade Guard Show, I'm excited to be joined by my friend Kyle Dean to discuss emergency preparedness from a Catholic perspective, so that you and your family can be both physically and spiritually prepared for prolonged disaster events. Kyle and I met at the Catholic Creator Conference in Steubenville this past summer and had a shared interest in emergency preparedness. So we thought it would be fun and hopefully edifying for those watching to discuss not only the typical things people think of, such as food, water, shelter, medical, and security, but also the spiritual side of emergency preparedness. Kyle is an authorized deliverance minister who has studied philosophy, theology, and the psychological sciences. He has served in leadership roles in the Fortune 100 and Global Fortune 500 sectors and helped earn his region the Pulitzer Prize of Broadcasting Journalism. Kyle is also a certified professional life coach, currently specializing in Catholic holistic flourishing. And today, Kyle and I are going to discuss things you and your family can do to prepare your souls for the types of trials that might be unique to disaster events. Before we get started, I just want to mention that Kyle and I are both Catholic, and so our faith informs our approach to these topics that we will be discussing today. And while we're certainly striving to harmonize with Catholic theology and moral principles on these matters, we aren't trying to claim that specific things we're recommending are dogmatically required unless otherwise explicitly stated, but rather suggest that they are prudent steps for families to take and steps that can be taken in good faith and in union with church teaching. All right, so Kyle, would you like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you first got interested in maybe emergency preparedness, and then also maybe touch on some of the preparations that you've made when it comes to some of the most important areas and some of the aspects of emergency preparedness?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, John. And I'm very excited about all the work that you do. And I feel blessed to have met you at that Creator Conference earlier this year. So I got involved with emergency preparedness, honestly, man, like a long time ago in the wake of 9/11. You know, 9/11 happened. I was in middle school when it happened, just dating myself a little bit there. And in the years following that, I was, blessed to have a technological prowess. Ended up going into that field post high school, and with that was kind of exposed to some extremely high IQ individuals who were, I mean, like, let's just, hackers, like people that knew how to do things that I was just like, who would even think to spend their free time doing that? But okay. And just blessed being at a top 3 computing college in America here. And in that experience, I learned very early on, like 2007, 2008, like some of the things behind what's really going on and how things function in this country, in this government, in the world. Looking for, some people kind of refer to them as truthers, and I think that can come with certain connotations, but essentially going on the philosopher's quest, which is, following the truth wherever it leads, regardless of the personal cost, truth seeking. And when I did that, I formulated my own views on what happened with 9/11. And then it kind of becomes the gateway into, well, if the official story has holes, like just glaring logical holes and challenges, and I don't even mean that in a controversial way, then the logical conclusion becomes, well, what else are we, is being hid from us, or if we're being lied to, where else could that be occurring? And then, you come to discover, I remember reading, like literally reading Agenda 21 when I was like, my early years of undergrad, and reading, learning about how few corporations control every aspect of media. And that's something that I think culturally in the past 5 years or so, people en masse, there's been like this critical mass that people have reached learning this. But for some reason, like, if a lot of people are becoming red pilled, I was almost born in Zion. And I think, to whom much is given, much is expected. So I found myself balancing this reality that I found myself in, and having to square that with, okay, if a terror attack had happened at a moment's notice, who am I to presume that I won't be affected? Especially, because I come from the state of New York. So when 9/11 happened, that was in my state. Like, so it really, really hit. And so, with that, I think that you have to have a healthy balance of what can I truly control here? What's within my control and what is not? Because otherwise, you'll have an unhealthy relationship with, how to respond. And my love for prepping kind of came in there mixed with just a natural love for all things nature, like camping and exploring and navigating and hiking and all of that stuff. I mean, I've always loved being in the outdoors. I get recharged in nature. So it just kind of became a glove fit from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so as you've worked through kind of those big things, food, water, shelter, medical security, or defense, um, are there any kind of, I know you can go on YouTube, you can watch lots of videos about, the most common ways to address some of those things. Are there any particular tips or tricks that you learned along the way that you were like, I saw them all doing it this way, but, I found if you make this tweak, it really goes a lot better, or any lessons learned that if you were starting over, you'd say, I would do it differently next time. Anything like that you've learned along the way?
There's always a way to refine and adapt. But honestly, man, I kind of developed my baseline before the internet blew up. So, I know there's, you got like your Doug Berries and Be Ready coalitions and other people that are out there. And I think that they do good work. But what I was rocking was this. Like a Pivy survival guide. The SAS is a British version, but I mean, there's so many different great versions that are out there, and you'll see when you look at this iPhone app now available. This was like back when apps were just starting to become a thing. And so good old fashioned analog, picking up a book, reading it, and yeah, you come to pick up patterns, right? Like little things that make it digestible and bite sized. Like one thing I want to bring to the viewers and listeners here is, the Catholic layman's way to balance. Okay, I need to kind of know this stuff, and I need to find my niche, perhaps, and just own it, but then almost set it and forget it. Like God calls us to flourish. He wants us to prosper, as it says in the third letter of John. And so, it's for me, it's like, okay, I know that you can't survive more than 3 seconds in outer space without dying, right? You can't survive more than 3 minutes without air. You can't survive more than 3 hours without heat of some source. In other words, if you're in the frigid cold without shelter, you can't survive more than 3 days without water, and you're not likely to survive more than 3 weeks without food, right? So when you learn little like devices like that, I think someone probably threw space in there to be cutesy, but who knows? That's the Wild West of today. So maybe someday that'll be even more and more relevant. But you get your basics there, right? The basic elements, food, water, fire, earth, right? And ether for our Chinese listeners. So when you know your relationship to the elements, and what's possible, what's important to have down, from there, I kind of adopt a strategy of, okay, have the knowledge, but then depending on the circumstances, in prudence, being ready for those circumstances. And I kind of boil it down to, there's either going to be a more ideal circumstance where I have my tools available to me, or there's the less ideal circumstance where I need to adapt in real time. Like if we're out in nature, and we don't have a lot of these different tools, well, now you have to make the tools, and you have to make a natural version of, for example, clean water, right? You need to know how to filter between like gravel and grass and rocks, and create a natural filtration system to have a clean water supply. So that's if you don't get to have your little, sippy straw going into the lake or whatever. So yeah, that's kind of my overall philosophy.
Yeah, yeah, I know. For me, when I was trying to build out some of my preps, I got into the game a little bit later than you did. For me, it was more coming out of a little post COVID time. When things were starting to heat up between Ukraine and Russia, and I think that was one of the first times where I kind of looking at how many kids we have in our family now, I was starting to say to myself, maybe things aren't quite as stable as growing up. I kind of thought, hey, we live in America. It's always just going to be like this. There's no, great nations never fall or restart or like it's gonna be like this forever. But I think that was maybe one of my first eye-opening experiences when I thought, it might be a good idea because for me as a father, the thought of something going wrong and my young kids looking to me and saying, "Hey, Dad, like we're thirsty, we're hungry, we're cold," and me not being able to do something to provide for them, that would just break my heart more than like anything else. So, um, I mean, not anything else. Obviously, the spiritual needs are of a higher degree. But
But it's all interrelated.
yeah, and so I'm also trying to take care of those needs as well. So I think that was one of the first things that really motivated me. And when I was trying to think through how do I want to address problems, sometimes I was seeing solutions that people were proposing that it was like, okay, this sounds like a good solution, but I think this could break easily, or I could see a lot of situations where this could not work out well, or this could fall apart. And so I was always trying to think of like what are the most bulletproof solutions I can come up with. So I would lean more towards like a rocket stove and a camping kettle as opposed to like, trying to have a generator with some sort of electrical cooking device because I'm like, those things can break, and if they do, now what? So trying to look at the more bulletproof stuff. But I think you mentioned me when we were kind of preparing a little bit and talking before we just our discussion today, about your twofold approach and how that might relate to something like a go bag of like, hey, if I have my go bag and then I have those supplies and I'm ready to go versus if I don't. So maybe I'll just ask you, do you want to share a little bit about how you kind of approach something like that? I've done a few episodes on my go bag and what's in it. So for you, if you're thinking about, hey, here's what I would do if I have that, or if I don't have that, what that looks like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll preface just by saying, again, for people that maybe haven't gotten into this before, that are even skeptical, we can talk more. I know we'll talk more about moral objections later, but um, to answer this question, I would say focus on what you're good at. Maybe start there. You know what I mean? You kind of touched on some of the big ones. There's different philosophies and different ways to remember to make sure that you're holistic in your approach. There's food, water, shelter, medical, and security, right? That could be offense, defense, and that's gonna resonate with people in different ways, depending on their comfort levels, depending on their dispositions, depending on their gifts and their talents. So, for me, I try to at least a very basic level have some semblance of a plan with all of it, while also being real about the fact that I don't have like medical credentials. I know that it's extremely important to have a tourniquet in your med kit. um have I taken a class recently on the proper bandaging and how to do all this stuff? Admittedly, no. And so I really, really hope that depending on the situation I'm in, I either am blessed by the Lord with an actual grace to maybe play that video before suddenly we find ourselves in a situation, or that I have relationships with people that we can share our gifts and talents and have some sort of like an economy of survival in that sense. So it's hard to give a one size fits all answer, of course, because it's like, what kind of a scenario are we talking about? Like, honestly, if it's a nuke, man, I don't know if I want to be around, unless like I'm blessed like those Jesuits in Japan during World War II, who were praying a rosary every day and literally didn't get impacted. I mean, that's what I'm going for, but that's going to be the more spiritual discussion aspect. But if it's something like, let's just say, an EMP, right? Well, uh, I would advocate for having a Faraday cage, right? Because it's just physics. It's basically like a logic tree. It's okay. What do you have available now, so that no matter what the scenario might be, you've reasonably done enough to have an edge when the thing happens, right? So if an EMP goes off, an electromagnetic pulse, it's going to kill electronics. To your point with having the generator or having the electric stove, right? You're going to be dead out of the water unless you happen to have a Faraday cage big enough to have your essential electronics in it, and the EMP goes off while everybody else is down. You've got that stuff. Okay, so that covers one aspect of the holistic framework. Now, what happens when your neighbors catch wind of the fact that you're the only one in town with that? Well, that's where a lot of people would say this is where security comes in, because depending on the relationship that you have with them and how much food and water and other resources are available to share, you may or may not be able to collaborate in that way. So, or if you think about like fire, right? So, obviously, what's ideal in terms of convenience is that you've got a way to just make fire quickly, right? We've got our lighters that we just flick it and you're done. Like instant convenience. But when you're in a survival situation, some of the things that we take for granted are not necessarily it's not going to go down like that. You're going to need to either know how to rub wood together, or you're going to be out of luck. And that touches to I've got 3 hours to get this figured out. If you happen to be, a bit north of the equator like we are, or south, right? If you have real winters that you're looking at. So without giving too much of a super roundabout answer, all that's a long walk for a short drink to just emphasize how, a lot of this is circumstantial. So the universal that applies in all of those different circumstances is having a healthy prudence, right? Understanding the right thing to do at the right time given the circumstances, and have a plan A, have a plan B, have a plan C. So I have a basic level in my go bag of something that covers those five. And I also have pre-prepped with knowledge to say, all right, well, if my little quick fishing pole in my go bag fails me, or if I don't have access to my go bag in the actual circumstance I find myself in, plan B is, make some hooks and get out there with something homemade.
So, thinking of people who might be kind of tuning into this discussion and maybe they haven't thought a whole lot about prepping in the past, and they hear us talking about nuclear bombs, EMPs, neighbors turning on neighbors, like, and they say, wait a minute, this prepping stuff, this is just for extremists, this I don't know what you guys are talking about here. What are your thoughts on why being prepared in this kind of way is actually a prudent step for Christian fathers or parents to be taking? Why is this a wise and prudent thing as opposed to just some sort of extremist type of position?
Well, to them, I would just say, yeah, go ahead, just keep doing what you're doing. Go back to sleep. And when things go down, the adults are going to be taking care of it. And God bless you. I hope it works out for you. Obviously, it's tongue in cheek, but realistically speaking, as men of faith in particular, we are driven by charity, right? So, and charity is love of God and love of neighbor for the sake of God, right? So that is ultimately our framework with how to carry ourselves. And I understand the sentiment, but honestly, in 2024 and beyond, as of when we're recording this post election, if there's really still anybody out there that's gravitates to this kind of a viewership and that does not realize that, you know, there's a fragility to the system, right? To the grid, to our water systems, our electrical systems. I mean, God bless you, but where have you been? if you just tune into even basic mainstream news, you realize that there's some serious wars going on around the world. There's escalations happening every single day. We're literally on the brink of World War III, and some say, like the Holy Father Pope Francis, I think it was as early as around 2013 or 2014, he was saying then we are in World War III. He said this one looks different than the ones in the past. He referred to it specifically as piecemeal. He said this is a piecemeal war. In other words, there's a progression going on there. And, I would kind of agree with that sentiment because, again, it all goes back to 9/11. There were things that happened there, and then there's a chain of causation You get top military generals. I remember back in like 2007 that were coming out and saying, we're going into 7 countries. And back then it was like, what are you talking about? Osama bin Laden's the dude we're going after here. And then we all found out there was way more going on there than what met the eye. So, for people that are just hemming and hawing about whether or not this is relevant to them, you know, I would give a an admonition, right? Because one of the works of mercy is to warn people, um, when by the time something extreme happens, um, that is not time for someone like John or myself to be just sitting there and educating you on this stuff. I mean, if we can, in little bits and pieces, then that's a tremendous blessing. But you can't expect that from people who have actually put in the effort up front. And last thing I'll say, think about anything that is hard and meticulous and that takes prep work. I'm thinking for some reason the Lord's putting on my heart right now, like the Blue Angels, or anybody in military who are going through those flyby sessions. The amount of prep work that they put into that display to be able to, with precision, fly these airplanes in just such a picture perfect way so that we can be wowed by the spectacle. I mean, it looks awesome, but when they're preparing, they are sitting there in their mind and they are going over the logic tree of, okay, this second I turn this way I turn right. And they have to nail it because there is no plan B. Like plan B is you're dead. You know what I mean? And and there's no emotion to that. It's not personal. It's not really, the lower passions really have no seat at the adult table when it comes to discussions like this. And the reality is that the vast majority of preparedness, physical and spiritual, is just that, preparedness. It's what's going on before the event happens.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you mentioned, a little bit ago about escalation. I mean, I heard just yesterday, I saw a headline about Biden authorizing the use of long range U.S. missiles for Ukraine to strike inside Russia. So
That's right.
you know, where does that go? How does that potentially escalate? We pray for peace. We pray that it doesn't escalate. But I mean, certainly anyone could see how that could escalate. And I think not to get overly political here in this episode or whatever on this channel, but
Yeah, I'm an
I think
apolitical guy.
yeah. So I mean, I think some people after the election, might be feeling like a little sense of exhalation or a little relief of like, okay, things are going to get better now. But we still have several months left before policies change in a different direction, and if there's groups who are potentially looking to do something or strike against the U.S., and if they have sleeper cells in the U.S. that have come across the border over the past however many years, and if they're saying, hey, we have a couple months left before things tighten up, the next couple months could actually be a precarious kind of time, as we're kind of moving forward. So, I mean, I pray nothing happens. I pray it's peaceful and everything goes smoothly. But I think, it's wise for people not to just rest and say, okay, yeah, everything's going to be fine now. I think, the time for preparing is still, we're glad we have this opportunity, but let's not squander it and take it for granted.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what was the Psalm 141 or 143 or whatever it was that says, place not your trust in princes? Right. So let's say, to those who do politically lean the way you just described, that they want to take a breath of relief because there's going to be a changing of the guard. Even then, let's say it's the absolute best case scenario. It turns out Trump's not Hitler, kind of like how he wasn't for his first administration. And and there's no new wars again, and everything looks great. Okay, so again, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. That's true across the board in a whole litany of conversations. Preparedness, not least of which on that list. It's actually quite high. So it's kind of like, I love finding myself in win-win situations, right? Anybody who does business, anybody who, strikes up a deal, and is good at it, is finding themselves in a situation where everybody is winning. You know what I mean? Like, I only, for one, I don't know about you, John, but I only like to do business with people that get what they want. You know what I mean? Because if not, what are you doing? You know what I mean? And so too with this situation, you're winning because, one of my favorite mantras in life. I'm a life coach. I'm a certified professional life coach, and I love inspiring people. You've got, mindset is key to so much of anything and everything you do if you want to accomplish your goals and your intentions. And one of my favorite mantras of all time is, I am either winning or I'm learning, which is winning, so I'm winning. You know what I mean? So it's like, if you have this knowledge that can give you peace of mind and peace in your soul, that's great. But then for the situation where turns out you place your trust in the prince didn't follow through because Jesus warned you not to do that. Uh, you're either going to wish that you did some learning, or you're going to be as ready as you could have been.
I know part of what we're talking about today is a little bit about the physical part of emergency preparedness, but also we wanted to address the spiritual elements as well. And so now that we've kind of established that prepping isn't just for extremists, um, how would we say that prepping can actually be an act of virtue? And what virtues do we see in the Catholic faith that we could say, hey, here's how preparing for emergencies and trying to take care of our family in these ways actually is an exercise of this virtue or that virtue. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So, I'm a holistic Catholic coach. So there are 7 heavenly virtues, right? There's 4 moral virtues or cardinal virtues. There's prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And then there's 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. We get the 4 cardinal virtues from the Book of Wisdom. And we get, faith, hope, and charity is mentioned in multiple places, not least of which is 1 Corinthians 13, a lot of people's favorite wedding verse, coupling of choice. So, and it impacts all of them, right? So, in some way, shape, or form, they're all interrelated. And for prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, there's a natural version of these virtues, and there's also a supernatural version. The supernatural version being having God as its end. So, what does that look like specifically when it comes to prepping and exercising Christian virtue? Well, we've touched on prudence multiple times, right? Prudence is knowing the right thing to do at the right time, given the circumstances. St. Thomas Aquinas breaks down 8 integral sub virtues that comprise prudence, and you have to be sufficiently competent at all 8 of them concurrently, or else you cannot be said to be a prudent person. So it's a real challenge. It starts with knowing these things. People should do their research and make sure they understand this stuff. And then it's, of course, exercising it. And, in order to even be a prudent person, this kind of goes outside of the scope of preparedness per se, but I'm going to say it because we're especially talking about being a Christian man of virtue here. One of the greatest epidemics out there is a lack of chastity, pornography, and just these horrible scourges. And what a lot of people don't understand is that if you're not a chaste person, so now we're leaning into temperance here. If you're not a chaste person, you are categorically incapable of even beginning to become a prudent person. Prudence is actually just severed. It's cut off from you having any access to it. So, and the reason that I prefaced with that is because there's no point in us even having the rest of this conversation if you're not shored up in that area, because you need prudence in order to exercise the rest of the virtues that we're touching on here. So you can maybe begin to see how this is like a holistic package here. The spiritual preparedness that is required of us. So, prudence is knowing the right thing to do at the right time. It's having enough of a knowledge, enough of a foresight. One of the sub virtues is foresight, to say, this is the list of the most likely things that could happen, right? You touched on a specific example, the fact that you have these terror cells in our country. You have, and that's not a conspiracy theory, by the way. Many top intelligence officials across different respected agencies in our country have come out and they said it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? So we know that. And so the question becomes like, what are some of the scenarios that could look like? And what can I do in my circumstances to respond to that, right? That's prudence exercised, right? That's looking at a specific set of circumstances and saying and formulating your action plan. Justice is rendering to another his or her due, right? So with spiritual preparedness, you have the natural version of justice. This is just pertaining to any sort of commutative justice, distributive justice, retributive justice. Your relationship to civilization, government, the legal system, and just making sure that you're a good person to other people. But then there's that supernatural version of justice, which is rendering, God his due. And that's where you find, one of the sub virtues of justice is religion. And, and within there's also prayer. So, you need to have a well defined, developed, and lived out prayer life if you're going to be spiritually prepared for whatever can come. And by the way, to make this real for people, we as Catholics, we of course, we pray the Hail Mary, and you see there at the end of it, now and at the hour of our death, we ask for Mary's intercession. So the reality is that we all have to be prepped spiritually for a disaster. It's called death, and none of us are going to escape it unless you're like the once in millennia, like, Enoch or Elijah or something. Like, you're not going to escape it. And so again, that maybe helps some people to realize like this applies to me too. You don't have to just think of some sort of a natural disaster that's coming. Spiritual preparedness is absolutely for everybody because your soul is something that you need to be that you need to protect and you need to guard. So we're kind of leaning into spiritual warfare right now. The fact that there is this battle for our soul, and we wage against the world, the flesh, and the devil. So there's these natural enemies, and then there are these preternatural enemies that we need to be on guard against. And if you lean into the virtue of justice, both naturally and supernaturally, and you're rendering to others their due, and you're rendering to God his due, um, you're going to be best prepared to win that spiritual war, right? Which translates into experiencing eternal beatitude in heaven with our Creator, with God our Father. And God grant that everyone who hears this takes that seriously and achieves that. So then you look at fortitude, right? Fortitude is the ability and the willingness to engage the arduous or the difficult, right? So obviously, preparedness is all about anticipating hard times, right? So, I mean, I think this virtue hopefully speaks for itself. Not only is there a natural and a supernatural version of the virtue, there's also the gift of fortitude. It's one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit confected at confirmation or chrismation. You're looking at fear of the Lord, piety, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. So those are the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. And God realized that mankind needs so much fortitude that I'm going to give you the gift on top of the virtue. If you would only, humble ourselves and submit to God's design and receive that gift. So fortitude is so important for us to not only take on the arduousness of spiritual preparation, but then ultimately to meet the moment when it comes. And, last thing I will say on that is, you know, if you're not already doing the things that are necessary, I mean, just the bare minimum, right? Like you've got the precepts of the church, like to go to church every week, to receive the Eucharist at least once a year, to go to confession at least once a year. Like those are the absolute bare minimum to hit justice towards God. But we're all called to charity, right? Charity would be it's love, right? It's love. That would be doing much, much more than that. My point is, even in the name of fortitude, if you're just doing the bare minimum, do you really think that you're going to be ready for when things are exponentially harder than they already are now? Probably not. So it's something to think about. And then, so now with temperance, right? Temperance is moderation in relationship to pleasure, right? So things pertaining to food, things pertaining to the sixth and ninth commandments, the venereal pleasure. Um, what is that going to look like when you're falling upon hard times, right? Like if somebody's not a chaste person, do you really? I mean, just speaking primally here for a moment. Do you really think that your lifestyle is going to translate into whatever situation you find? If you're chilling in a FEMA camp, you think you're going to get to be as to scratch your itch, and even if in some weird way you could, like you are expending a tremendous amount of energy if you're at these base level of pleasures, and you're going to need all the energy you can find to push yourself through a situation where, let's say, you don't have regular access to food, or whatever the case may be. So maybe we'll come back to that one. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because when it comes to temperance, no matter where you fall on that spectrum currently, you need to be stellar. You need to be above average when you're ready to meet those moments. And then, faith, it's all about right reason and right faith are what inform our relationship to reality around us, and the reality of God, like the actual divine truths. So, faith, a lot of Protestants think that faith is only this like passive reception of I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. As Catholics, we have a very different understanding of the virtue of faith. It's actually a very intellectual endeavor. We have what's referred to as the fides qua as well as the fides quae. And the fides qua is this like subjective relationship to divine truths. And then the fides quae is the objective reality of what those truths are. What are the dogmas? What are the doctrines? And also, what are the current disciplines that I need to be aware of, in terms of how the church expresses herself in this day and age, right? Because that's what's pertinent to us in our generation. And then with hope is so important to have, because hope is the anticipation of a good that is not yet realized, right? And of course, our ultimate hope is again in eternal beatitude in heaven. And we all need to have a good relationship with hope, because one thing that's true about all of the virtues is you're either going to have a deficit or you're going to have an excess in relationship to them if you're not balanced, right? Virtue lies in the mean between excess and deficit. And so too with hope. If you don't have enough of it, that's actually a vice or a sin that's referred to as despair. And that's something that a lot of people are going to have to combat if you find yourself in an emergency situation. And then on the other end, if you have too much hope, maybe your hope isn't in God, but it's more on yourself, right? And that's another thing that as preppers, people need to be aware. Like the fact of the matter is that you could prepare for every natural circumstance in the world, but God might just pull a surprise on all of us. We don't know exactly what this thing's going to look like. And that's why you have to have the spiritual preparedness. If you have too much hope and are hope in the wrong place, like yourself, that's presumption. And that's not going to help you out. And then, of course, finally, we have the virtue of all virtues, the one virtue that is God himself, and that's charity. And that's the X factor that you can look at all the other topics that we just touched on, but um, if you find yourself in the circumstance in the moment, you have to really have a healthy relationship with like, how do I love these other people that maybe didn't prepare as much? um in relationship to, like, people are gonna be like, are you call yourself a Christian? Are you, why don't you just do all the things and I'll just show up to the party when everything goes down? Because if you're really a Christian and if you really have charity, you should just be taking care of us anyway. Sorry, that's actually not how this works, and we'll get into that a little bit more, maybe in a minute here. But having a healthy understanding of the seven heavenly virtues and maximizing your stats in the here and now can only help you when the going gets tough.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, I think looking at like charity and justice, how you were just talking about it, that need to be able to say, okay, how do we understand how these fit together? Because if we latch on to one and don't have a proper understanding of that balance, that mean, and how they work together, yeah, we can see how we can go off the rails pretty easily or pretty quickly. And when you were talking about temperance and those sub virtues, you know, looking at where that could go if somebody said, in a situation where we have grids down, it's an emergency, and the macho part of the manly father comes out, or maybe not even a father, just men in general who, I'm courageous, I got fortitude, I'm gonna survive, and like, there's no more law enforcement. Now it's just me and my band of buddies, and we can take what we want, kind of thing. And you could see how a misunderstanding of some virtues could quickly go off the rails when it's not tempered by that whole picture. And if you don't have, like you said, if you don't have all of them working together, if you think you have a couple, you probably don't really have any, and you're kind of off the rails now. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense there. And I think, like you said, we'll talk a little bit about charity, justice, how they work together and complement each other. But one thing that maybe I'll kind of transition right now is when you talked about fortitude and how if we're not practicing them now, if we're not something like fortitude, if we're not building that virtue now, and then we expect that when disaster strikes, we're just going to somehow get that injection of fortitude and be ready to go and respond virtuously. Probably not going to happen that way. Something like fasting is probably a good example, or something that kind of exemplifies that. So if we're talking about fasting, in the Latin Rite, the church's fasting requirements during Lent and things like this, at least at present time, aren't overly strict. I would say, they were more strict in the past, and so now the requirements to just meet that minimum threshold to satisfy liturgical law isn't the most strict fasting requirement you can imagine. So why might it be important? We could talk about from a spiritual level how fasting is beneficial, but also for something like emergency preparedness from a physical level, doing fasting now, water fasting for not just one meal, but multiple meals or maybe even multiple days. How does that benefit if we're doing that now? If we're building up that ability in our body to say, hey, my body knows what this is like. My body is able to do this. I'm able to function through this without having, a mental or physical breakdown. If we're doing this now, while times are not yet, back against the wall emergency, how that would be beneficial if we do end up in some sort of emergency situation. Maybe I'll let you kind of comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, actually, you're touching on something that's really near and dear to my heart on this one. We didn't do any like prep before we came on the air for this, John, but I'll actually open with a testimony on this one. I have to thank Padre Pio for instilling in me the virtues of fasting. And I say virtues because I'm referring to natural and supernatural here. It was 10 years ago that I started fasting for the first time. And I'd kind of had my, conversion as an adult into the fullness of the truth after going on a very interesting journey. And I was watching a Padre Pio film. I cannot recommend it enough to everybody. It's called Miracle Man. There's at least two really good versions of a Padre Pio film. I didn't bother with the new one when I found out, that there was some scandal in there. But I don't remember the name of the one, but they're both like 3 hours and 20 minutes long. So if you're gonna, get your popcorn ready, and maybe have a bathroom break halfway through. But Uh, Padre Pio Miracle Man came out in the early 2000s. And what happened to me was I'm sitting here watching it, and I already, knew that I loved this saint. I had been developing a devotion to him, but this is where it went to the next level. And, and I never looked back. I was so touched by his life, and particularly the parallels in my own life, because I've had some extraordinary spiritual experiences throughout my life, that a lot of people don't ever experience. And I didn't know what to do with that, because like him, like he was a little kid and he was seeing his angel, for example, and he was seeing saints, and he just assumed in his youth like everybody goes through that, and it's like, no, most people actually don't go through that. And without getting in too much into my own testimony writ large and how I related to that, when the movie ended, I it wasn't a locution, but I had this like inner knowing that one of the key pieces that's missing in your life right now is fasting, right? Because we need to do prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. It's part of living out the Christian virtues. And so it was a Monday night when I saw the film, and I was so touched. I ended up doing something that ended up developing later into a challenge, if you will. And I've had the great privilege and honor of training up around 24 men to date on this challenge. It's called the High Priest Fast. And that is fasting on nothing but water from Monday until the following Sunday. So about 6 days straight on water, and until you receive our Lord in the Eucharist. And there's a number of reasons, pedagogically, that that's how it ended up panning out for me. Not least of which is that supernatural component to fasting, which is the reason that you're doing it is to grow in relationship with your creator, to grow in holiness, to grow in the rest of the virtues by experiencing mortification, right? That's Latin mortis facere, to make dead, or to make one dead, to deny yourself, to deny your body, to fulfill what is stated in the New Testament in various places, right? Like, we know that, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And, you have to, check your body or your lower passions so that you can allow your soul to thrive, right? Where your intellect has to be your king and your will is your queen. Um, and so I found myself on that first of what became many journeys with the High Priest Fast. And there's just no words. There are no words for how grateful I am to Jesus Christ and Padre Pio for bringing me on that journey, for helping me to I went from never fasting in my life to that, which is a little intense. I should throw a huge caveat on here for anybody that's listening. Don't do that unless you're prepared. Unless, clear it with your medical doctor, make sure if you have any preconceived medical conditions or anything, you have to factor that in if you take medications or something.
So
And
did you go from this never fasting to that 6 day water fast? Like, was there an in between where you tried a 1 day or a 3 day first, or did you go from 0 to 6 and full tilt?
yes, no, I'd never fasted before that.
Oh, okay. Wow.
That I remember. I mean, like, there might have been, like I was poor in college and I didn't have cash in my pocket that day, and I had to wait until the campus event that evening or something. But like, I never like purposely or consciously went a day or longer without eating food before.
So you never did like a 2 or 3 day water fast to kind of work up to it. You went from zero to that full thing. That's pretty impressive.
Well, and all glory to God. I
Yeah.
mean, I had a vision of a brown monk visit me in my dream the first night or the second night. Like, I mean, again, there's context here. I had a near death experience when I was a teenager, and when I was enveloped by the divine light. And when I came back into this earth, I started having countless. It's over 1,000 at this point. Premonition dreams. I would just dream and it would come true. I would dream and it would come true. And so I have a specific charism and relationship with the Lord that enables me to do what I do. And I think anybody can get there. It actually it connects to the levels of prayer. There's 9 levels in Teresian prayer. Maybe we can get into that if you want to a bit more, but just to keep it on the question that you asked me, we need to fast in some way, shape, or form. Um, you know, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And if you're not already tough, you're not going to know what you're made of. I mean, God forbid, again, we can take it to the extremes. And I think that those are useful as long as you can couch it in a healthy, like, thought experiment and not ruminate or get anxious, because anxiety is not of the Lord. But, you think of, like, what would happen if I was in a concentration camp? You know what I mean? Like, well, you're going to be forced to do hard manual labor and you're going to have little to no food. Does your body know what that feels like? Mine does, like, big time. And if you already know how to do it, then that's one less thing to worry about when you're in the situation. Now, I could hear people just being like, "Oh, I would never do it anyway, and I would object." And this, it's like, okay, whatever. If you think that's the case, fine. But again, as you had mentioned, you're a family man. You don't have any clue what you might find yourself into. And the reality is that there's also, um, let us never forget that God will not be mocked. He is not mocked. It may look like it sometimes. I know certainly some of the celebrities in Hollywood make it seem like it with the crazy things that they're doing out there and trying to normalize, but God always gets the last laugh. So if you find yourself in one of these extraordinary circumstances, um, just run the race, complete the race. And if you lean into faith in Jesus Christ, who knows what's going to happen? If you're imprisoned unjustly, something that I again, know a thing or two about, all of a sudden an angel can come and blow the door open. You know, these things like this happen in the 21st century. If you lean into the experience, you may be an instrument of God's justice in some way. Look at Maximilian Kolbe, perfect example. Like, even the fact, the fact that they allowed him to swap places with the family man so that family man could live is its own miracle, because they didn't have to do that. But somehow, some way, God allowed, through the grace of the situation, he sets up the parameters of how his victory is going to come about. You look at, certain saints who they wanted to, what was the saint who they wanted to, throw into the Colosseum because she didn't want to give away her virginity, and she became a stone. They couldn't move her. Like, the point is that if you have enough faith to move mountains, these kinds of things can and do happen. So you just shore yourself up on the natural level and let God do the rest.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think, like we were saying, practicing fasting now, or practicing chastity now, like you were talking about earlier, practicing self-control, doing these things now, like kind of like I was saying before, while your back isn't against the wall, while you're not in an extreme stress situation, you can see, okay, I tried fasting for a day, for 2 days, for 3, 4, 5 days. Was I able to handle that? Was I not able to handle that? When I'm practicing chastity, am I able to be steady? Am I able to, not lose my cool and lose my peace, or whatever it might be, whatever level of self-control there, you learn something about yourself, and you see, okay, where was I able to do that successfully, or where do I say, wow, I thought I was stronger than that, but I'm actually weaker than I thought I was, and that's something to take back to prayer. That's an area I need to grow in, but doing that now while we have the opportunity. Then when we get in that situation where we have to do it, not because we're choosing to, but because we're forced into that situation, now we can be more the man God's calling us to be for our family, right? Now we can be somebody who's saying, all right, now I'm going to step up to the plate. I'm going to do this willingly, and I can do it well because I know myself. I'm able to, do this in this certain way, versus if we're trying to just wing it on the fly, I think even too, when we're talking about exercising prudence and right judgment, if we're forced into a situation where we're fasting against our will, or we're forced into chastity against our will, and we haven't practiced doing some of these things voluntarily, well, now this might cloud our right judgment, right? And that now our decision making for ourselves, for our family, maybe we're not making the best decisions that we could be making on either a natural or a spiritual level for ourselves or for our family, because we're, it's all clouded and it's working together against us instead of working together for us. So I guess that'd be some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are your thoughts on, the reality that at the end of the day, we're all just talking about becoming saints. That's one of the things that's kind of cool about all of this. You look at the purgative way to perfection. It's the first step, right? That's where prayers level 1 through 4 come in. You got vocal prayer, mental prayer, effective prayer, and prayer of simplicity. Then you've got the illuminative way. At that point, you should really have, a spiritual guide. That's levels 5 through 8 of prayer, where God comes in and does the rest of the purifying and illuminates you to these divine realities that are just beyond this life. And then, God willing, you make it. You fulfill what Vatican II said in the universal call to holiness at level 9 of prayer, the transforming union, which is where you're in the unitive way, where the mystics refer to seeing the Trinity indwelling in one's soul, and it never goes away from that point on. um, you know, what we're talking about right now when it comes to, being good at fasting, for example, is, again, and by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. It's a sub virtue under temperance specifically, and it absolutely requires fortitude to complement it, and it fulfills justice, right, in relationship to God, as long as you're not just doing it to constantly hop on a scale and get giddy about how you're losing weight or whatever the thing is. Like, again, you have to have the right mindset. So it all interrelates, but it's practicing temperance and mortification, right? The denying oneself, recognizing, like, I'm not the center of the universe. I am called to become a refined instrument of Jesus Christ, because He is King. Um, you know, when we're doing that, and when, God willing, you're reaching those higher levels, you reach a point where you actually, like, that's all you want to do, like, mortification, death to self, suffering. um and please don't get it confused with some, like, sadomasochistic endeavor. We're talking about having a right relationship with suffering well, the science of the cross, actually, which is the instrument of our salvation. And, John, I want to get your thoughts on that, because I think, a lot of people don't realize, like, that's the frame of mindset, right? We're back to mindset here, that you need to be in to be able to actually push yourself to take up, let's say, a level of fasting that someone has never done before. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, I mean, I think that ability to suffer well is one of the things that kind of Catholicism helps to give a lot of meaning and purpose to, and helps people to understand in ways that maybe some of our non-Catholic brothers and sisters maybe don't have quite as much theology around suffering well. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those things that nobody enjoys that part quite as much, and we don't run towards it. Um,
Except for the saints.
well, that's true. Right. Right. Yeah. So being able to embrace that willingly, and understand how we're joining that, and uniting that with Christ, and growing in holiness through that process, right? I mean, we can actually make the suffering that we would experience during times of trial or emergency, actually just use that as more opportunity, right? To grow in holiness, to offer it up for our family, for our sins, for for those around us, and to actually grow in holiness while we're suffering, while we're living out these other virtues too. So yeah, I mean, I think if we're keeping that all, like, in your holistic approach, like you like to say, that can actually work together for our benefit there as well.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's not looking for suffering. It's not going out of your way, right? We're not called to pick up crosses on the battlefield that aren't ours to pick up. But, it's one of those, if you're so right with God, you kind of have a peace no matter what gets thrown at you. And then you become that instrument of showing the world, the flesh, and the devil that they do not have dominion or the final say over the universe and where this is all going.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been a great discussion. So maybe we'll switch gears here for a little bit. And we've been talking a lot on the spiritual side, which has been wonderful. Switching back a little bit to the semi-practical side, but still tied into the spiritual aspect of it. Um,
Sure.
you know, when we talk about prepping, a lot of people start thinking, especially guys, okay, what do I need to get? I need to get this gear. I need to get these supplies. So if we're thinking about that from a spiritual aspect, and we're saying, okay, what resources, what materials, what books, what supplies, what are things that I'd want to have on hand, from not to eat or drink, but from a spiritual standpoint. So to my mind, some of the first things that come to mind, maybe I want certain devotionals. Maybe I want to make sure I have, enough. I know for me, when I pray some of the prayers of the Liturgy of the Hours, I'm using an app on my phone, but maybe we want to have some prayer books on hand so our family can pray, some of the Liturgy of the Hours together as a family. Maybe we want some other devotionals that our family really enjoys, holy water, blessed candles, things like this. What are your thoughts on some of those types of things that would be good to have on hand for emergencies?
Yeah, absolutely. I echo everything you just said. I think that that's great. Morale, you never underestimate the power of morale, right? So again, some subjectivity to that in terms of what specific hymns are family favorites, and then there's also an objectivity to that. And for me, I'm really big on like, researching as able, on any given topic, like objectively speaking, if there is such a thing here, like what is the best, and maximize that, right? Like it's like the 80-20 rule or something. It's like, work, smarter, not harder. And in the spiritual life, that's no different, right? It's like if I have limited space in my go bag, let me make sure that I have the top priority in there. Or again, if I know that I'm going to find myself in a situation where I might not have the go bag, do I just have it pre-programmed in my mind, like those, Blue Angels fighters, that I know that I can rely on these things. These are the things that I should be prioritizing in my orarium, right? What is an orarium? Our orarium is our daily regimen that and all the most successful people, whether you're talking the Dale Carnegies of the world, winning friends and influencing people, or whether you're talking about our great saints, they have an orarium. So it's one of those, we should already kind of have this now, and then by the time the event happens, you just kind of shift into that. It's almost autopilot. And we know this too because when military men are trained up, and let's say, like in the Navy, let's say you're chilling, aside the main watercraft, and there was an explosion, and now you're on the life raft. They and let's say that you're literally like trauma ended up getting triggered because you were just impacted by this violent blast. They actually train them up in that moment. They say, if you've got your sidearm, like your pistol, just take the pistol apart and put the pistol back together. In other words, like shift your brain to just something that is so second nature that you can just do it. And then, your mind will be able to reset and get back into the zone, so to speak. So again, that's why I just really want to emphasize this preparedness is no joke. Like there's physiology behind this. There's a lot of research behind this. It's what the top performers do. So it speaks for itself. And, spiritually speaking, I would say that the hierarchy, the objectives, in terms of maximum impact would be on the prayer front. You've got three tiers. You've got public prayer, you've got private common prayer, and then private personal prayer. Right? This is like what the church teaches. This isn't my opinion. And in public prayer, there's part one and there's part two. Part one is the liturgy, right? The holy sacrifice of the Mass, where we receive the Eucharist. It's objectively speaking the most important means of grace and of our salvation that we can have access to. These are things, God willing, you should be trying to go daily if you have access to it now. But when the event happens, we're going to presume that you may or may not be able to have access to that. And that actually brings up a good point too here. Like, we haven't touched as much on relationships, right? And the power of, we're talking morale, but that corresponds to relationships. If you can somehow have in your action plan that a priest is going to be wherever you are, why not prioritize that? Right, because they're the ones that provide the means of our salvation. Now, that being said, we know from Our Lady of Akita, a church approved apparition, that Our Lady said there's going to come a time where all you're going to have left is your rosary and the sign from on high. So that's pedagogically super important, because the Blessed Mother is a great mother. She's the best mother there is. And like a good mother, she comes and she kind of gives us these hints or these warnings, because she's looking out for her children. So we know that it's most likely the priest isn't going to be available. So what's the backup plan? Part two of public prayer. And that is the divine office. So I, for one, consistently recommend what's called the Little Office of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This one in particular is Baronius Press. I don't have any, relationship with them currently, but I just think it's incredibly well done. I'm also a Latin nerd, so I love the traditional Latin Mass. So they've got, you've got everything in there that you could need in that regard. And a little office is the lay version of doing the divine office. So it's actually designed to be something that is able to be done even though we're still in the world, right? We're not of the world, but we are in the world in a way that our priests aren't, right? They're typically in the sanctuary. But we have to be present. And even here in the 21st century, where you have so many different things vying for your time and attention and energy, if you're spiritually prepping for maximum return on investment, this is it right here. And in fact, it's blown my mind. You got some top Catholic influencers out there, and they don't consistently mention this. So, this is even more powerful than the rosary. St. Alphonsus de Liguori, who's the moral doctor of the church, states that doing a daily office is worth 100 rosaries a day. So really important to know how this thing works. There's an entire theology on this. I mean, a whole video or series could be done on this, but you've got specific hours of the day that are more exalted hierarchically than others. A lot of people don't realize this, but that's what the office, gets into. You've got matins, typically or historically at midnight, although different religious orders flex some of these at some times. You've got lauds, you've got prime, which is, been suppressed in Vatican II Sacrosanctum Concilium 89 Part A, but, laity can still do it. Terce sexton known at 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m. There's also a rich history with like the changing of the guards with the Roman sentries back in the day. And then you have Vespers, which is evening prayer, and then Compline, which is like night prayer before bed. So you've got these 8 hours, and they're done at specific times because they correspond to specific events that happened in the life of Christ and the apostles that are more spiritually charged than other times of the day. So I highly recommend people look into that. It's a specific kind of a devotion. This isn't like a rosary where you can just pick it up at any given moment of the day. So I just wanted to make sure to emphasize that. Like, there's set times and there's a whole theology behind what's going on at that time, and it will deeply enrich your faith and gain you access to levels of grace that are much higher than even the rosary. But then from there, you've got level 2, which is private common prayer. And St. Louis de Montfort has written, some of the great works on Mariology. And in his Secret to Mary, he reveals that the secret to Mary is that if you're doing a group rosary, you are getting the amount of grace as the number of people present, as if that many rosaries were being prayed by you, multiplied by the holiest person present. So if you could get Padre Pio in your prayer team, you're in a good spot, So, so there's that, and that's something that you can translate to family morale, right? In terms of your practice. And then there's private personal prayer, right? That would be like doing a rosary by yourself or any other devotional. But it's super important for people to realize there is a hierarchy here. It's an objective reality. It doesn't have anything to do with anybody's personal devotional preferences. Like, this is what the church teaches. So I would highly recommend maximize your stats, especially if you find yourself in a circumstance where you're going to need all the grace that you can get. And finally, with hymnals too, objectively speaking, Gregorian chant is the highest form of music that there is. And that has to do with it really, really pertains to the intellect in particular, with the words that are being used and how God is being exalted. It's much more impactful than any of the other more common hymns that have become popularized in recent decades. But again, from there, I mean, whatever works for the family. And if you got small children, you meet them at their level. And I would say go for it with all of that.
So Kyle, are you suggesting that if we don't have access to a priest, and obviously we can't replicate the mass exactly, but if we're trying to say, okay, we want to still be deep in the word, maybe we're doing Lectio Divina, but we also want to have some of that singing and which will boost morale, but also bring some of that in as well. Are you suggesting that this might be an opportunity to not do some of the campfire guitar liturgical songs and do some more Gregorian chant instead? Is that?
Yeah, I'm all for that. Kumbaya, is good too. It's definitely good for morale, but make sure you get, some of the most edifying options in there, hopefully. You're also speaking to somebody who reintroduced Gregorian chant to his diocese for the first time and possibly since 1969. So I'm, call me biased if you will, but again, I would point out the reality that there is an objectivity even to the philosophy and theology of music.
Very good. Yeah. I know sometimes coming or going to mass, my kids, they're young, and so kind of their default is to be constantly entertained, and they'll say, Dad, can you put music on in the car? And I'm like, no, we're getting ready for mass. No, we want to. I'm like, okay, fine. I put Gregorian chant on, and I've actually had a couple times now when we'll say, okay, who wants to, they'll be asking for music, and I'll say, okay, what do you guys want to hear? I've actually had some of my kids, even like the younger ones, ask for Gregorian chant, and I'm like, yeah, I'm doing something right. So,
what, man, we favor going to the traditional Latin mass, although I'm in the East a lot as well. And when we end up at a Novus Ordo, I've got 4 children. I understand you've got 6. So you definitely know what it's like. I'm preaching to the Reverend here if we were Protestants, but you never know what you're going to get on any given mass with the different kids and their needs and levels of attention span and whatnot. But generally speaking, I echo what you're saying. It must be doing something right, because very frequently when we end up at a church that we're not normally at, we'll get someone that comes up to us and says, your children are so behaved. Like, what's your secret? How do you do it? And I have to credit, favoring the Latin mass environment. Because if it's primally just embedded into children from birth, that there's a silence to be maintained in relationship to what's going on with the sacred, and of course that separateness of the language. I know our modern sensibilities are like offended by this, and it's like, so what? God's offended by all your sins. Like, it's cool to be denied a sense, right? You're denied your auditory sense because you have to work harder to lean into there's something sacred or set apart happening here. And you see this in the East too with their royal gates. They deny your eyesight with what's going on behind there in the tabernacle. So we know that there's an ancient traditional connection there. And and of course, downstream from that is what kind of music do you end up seeing? What are the patterns that you recognize? And like all aspects of preparedness that we're touching on here, what you do now is going to have a huge impact on what that looks like when the going gets tough.
Yeah, very good. And I think one thing I'll just mention as we kind of wrap up that section of it there, hopefully this goes without saying for most people, hopefully people are going to confession more than just that once a year requirement that you mentioned. So hopefully a good examination of conscience is kind of already embedded in someone's mind, but I guess I would just throw in here too, certainly good if somebody maybe isn't quite there yet, isn't quite going as often, having on hand a good examination of conscience. If you can't get sacramental confession, to at least be able to be doing a daily exam and during that kind of time and still be kind of reflective in that way, I think would be helpful for people to have on hand as well.
100%. And just to keep it short, Pivy, and to the point, we're talking about how do we emulate what we would normally do in a time where we can't do that anymore, right? So obviously, the office is, it's actually considered liturgy, by the way. That's why it brings so much grace. So at least you're still able to do a form of liturgy, even if it isn't the mass. So there's that. Then there's, as you had said, yes, an examination of conscience. This is something that should be in everybody's daily orarium anyways. You can do one when you wake up. You can do one right before you go to bed. It takes a couple minutes. You just look over your day, like, what did I do well? What did I not do well? And seek to be better. Don't let, a lot of people, as they ascend the levels of prayer, on the ladder to holiness, they start getting dealt with the crucible of scruples. Something to be on guard with if you're doing an examination of conscience. It's not meant to take a long time, and it's not meant to gridlock you, but do that. And then also I would just, end by saying, if you're only doing, confessions less than monthly, look, I'm an authorized deliverance minister. I've been serving local exorcists for almost a decade now, and helping what are referred to as energumen. These are people who are extraordinarily diabolically influenced, possessed, helping to liberate them and get them free. And I could tell you, it's funny how when people actually are faced with extraordinary suffering, they don't have time to care about, oh, am I going to choose to go to confession this week, this month, or am I going to choose comfort and, Netflix and chill? They don't have that luxury like the rest of us have. And these are the people that are probably going to be higher in the hierarchy of sainthood if they complete the race well. So I would just say, take it from somebody who's actually in the industry. The industry best standard is, if you have any mortal sin in your life that's still messing you up, you have to go weekly. You can go daily. If a priest shames you, it's because he's lazy and he doesn't want to do his job. But Padre Pio went daily. But you should go at least weekly. And then once you have broken the chain of mortal sin in your life, then you can dial it back to monthly. But for those of us who are seeking not only the eternal reward, but a good place there, it's one of those, you're not really justice focused in your decision making, you're charity focused. And it becomes one of those things where you just want to be with your Lord as much as humanly possible. So you're probably going to do more than monthly anyways. But in an emergency situation where we don't have access to those sacraments anymore, examination of conscience is huge.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for that as well. All right, so getting on to a few of the more controversial or maybe exciting parts. I shouldn't say exciting parts, but some more interesting parts of the conversation here.
Let's go.
So thinking of one of the moral dilemmas that kind of comes up often in the prepping community, trying to, like we said earlier, balancing justice and charity. We can think of maybe some thought experiments where we say, okay, let's suppose, you've prepared, other people haven't, and one neighbor shows up at your door asking for a cup of water. Obviously, our initial Christian response is, of course, here's a cup of water, we're happy to help you, But you can also think of the thought experiment at the other extreme, where there's 50, 75, 100 people at your door who haven't prepared, and you have barely enough food and water for your family, and you might have a knee-jerk reaction where you'd love to be able to help take care of all those people, but you can't. You literally don't have enough supplies. And so we say, okay, what does that look like when we start wrestling with that moral dilemma? I just recently watched a movie trailer for a movie called Homestead. It's coming out on December 20th. And it looks like it tries to wrestle with this moral dilemma a little bit. I'm hoping they do a good job with it. I hope the ending and how they deal with it, shows proper reflection there. We'll see when it comes out. Right. But here, I'm gonna just, if we take a quick break here, we could take a look at a couple little clips from the trailer that kind of show this moral dilemma.
America's just been attacked. There's a guy been planning for the big one.
What is this place?
Welcome to Homestead.
Everyone's gonna want in.
My family's out here, and we're starving to death.
I wish we could help, but we can.
You can or you won't. Please.
People are gonna die at this gate. They're stealing your grain. They've cut off your solar power.
We need a world where people help strangers, not shoot at them.
Sometimes we think we're doing the right thing and then it all goes wrong.
Is this an ark? Or is this a fortress?
It's our home.
All right, so that does look like an interesting movie. I'm excited to see when it comes out. So, Kyle, what are your thoughts wrestling with this moral dilemma? How much assistance should we provide? Are we obligated to provide? How should we navigate those kinds of moral dilemmas that come up in a situation where we have some supplies, maybe, for some period of time for our family, but not enough for a whole community, but we still want to exercise charity, balance it with justice? What does that look like?
Yeah. But before we do that, I just gotta give a shout out to the lady in that trailer. She's like, "What are we really doing here?" Like women being the heart of the operation. And it's that classical dilemma. I've actually had years and years of reflection on this because I remember when I received my version of this moral dilemma, nerding out on the original Twilight Zone series. I highly recommend, if anybody wants to see a classical exposition on this topic, check out The Shelter. It's in like season 3 from like 1961, and old school, and not unlike this trailer. It's there's like nuclear war is imminent. You've got this one family that prepped. They've got like a shelter in their basement, like a bomb shelter. The other families on the block thought that they were nuts for prepping in this way. And then when everything hit the fan, now all of his neighbors are flocking to his door and like trying to like strong arm their way into the basement. And of course, leveraging things like, what about my kids? And it is like, listen, that's tough. Like, if you find yourself in that situation, God bless you. I would say that there's so much to say, but number one, for those of us who have actually, thought this thing through, part of your comprehensive preparation, and you see this in the Homestead trailer. And by the way, I know you're probably just going to show aspects of it, so sorry if I point to a part that you haven't, that you don't end up showing, but you see this in the trailer that there's layers to their preparation, right? Like when they're on the homestead, obviously security and defense is such that they have a literal fence and they have a protocol in place for trained snipers or people on the rifles to scan the outskirts of the approved area and the non-approved entry by anybody else coming in. In real life, that's got to be a part of your game plan. Now, some people might hear that and be like, oh, but that's not charitable. It's like, well, what are you talking about? What's not charitable is the people that are grifting or that are preparing to grift. It is not a secret in this day and age of having these kinds of conversations that, people who are preparing think about this stuff ahead of time. It's like, there are limited resources and it is an extraordinary circumstance. And I would remind people that, the same God who talks about, loving thy neighbor is the one who said, let the dead bury the dead. And, these might come off as like harsh words, but the reality is that it's not charitable for everybody now who sees that we're on the verge of a cold World War III going hot to not do some sort of sufficient preparation when your neighbors are, right? Because I would invite another scriptural reflection, which is, if you don't work, you don't eat. And what does eating do for us, right? Eating sounds super basic. It provides you energy. It provides you sustenance, longevity, the ability to persevere, right? So so there's obviously just physical food, MREs, right? Have some on hand if that's your thing. But if you're not preparing like everybody else is preparing right now, why do you get to eat later on, right? I mean, it's that would be presumption. So really a lot of what we're touching on right now is psychology. It's mindset. It's coming to realize, like, when you are in that extraordinary circumstance, you need to know your philosophical and your theological morality in order to be able to manage those kinds of situations. Because, if you're in a scenario like theirs, there's those layers. If people aren't even, getting to the point where they get to have this kind of conversation with you, where they get to guilt trip you, well, then you're not dealing with the guilt tripping. But if they do get to the point where they're guilt tripping you, then you need to be ready with the psychology of the situation. And that's not to say that, in an ideal circumstance, maybe you have extra to share, because that also becomes a good, collaboration and negotiation opportunity, to where it's like, okay, listen, you're part of the community and you're going to be able to have these resources. You need to provide this service to the overall operation, because, this is a holistic endeavor. Everybody needs to come and bring what they have to the table. So, it's understanding a healthy, awareness of what those different concepts mean in effect, right? Obviously, work or you don't eat does not apply to people with, extraordinary circumstances like special needs, or people who can't work because of a physical or psychological malady or spiritual. So in that situation, there needs to be empathy, the utmost empathy for that circumstance. But I'll throw a curveball at you on this one, John. One aspect of morality that a lot of Catholics might not be aware of pertains to what is and what isn't cannibalism. So I'm the spiritual child of Father Chad Ripperger. He's actually a colleague of mine. I've got, a signed copy of his works. We've collaborated before, and we're in the same industry with deliverance, but he's very, very renowned, very well known and popular. And he, in a recent conference, touched on this. He was saying, like, he was asked, is it cannibalism to eat human flesh if there's literally nothing else available? And he went into a whole exposition on the morality, because if you just give the answer and people don't like the answer, they're going to be scandalized. But the answer is that if there is genuinely nothing else available, it's not cannibalism. And it's not considered mortal. It's not considered sinful in that situation. So I don't know how much your viewers and listeners have taken time on that one, but it's like, are you ready? At least one person that's got really nice thighs. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways.
I'm sure most of us will save that for an absolute last resort before we resort to it. Yeah.
No, I would be horrified at the idea. I'd probably just fast myself to death before doing that, hopefully. But all joking aside, I think it bears touching on, because I remember my professor Scott Hahn teaching us in New Testament theology at the master's level. We did a real deep dive on Luke 24, touching on, or is it Matthew 24? I don't know. It's been a minute, but about the parousia, and about, what will it look like when the Son of Man returns? And, of course our Lord says, will I find faith left on earth, and this and that, but it's multivalent teaching what our Lord was doing. He was actually preparing people for the 70 AD overthrow of Jerusalem, and where the Jews were scattered throughout the earth from that point on. And Dr. Hahn really, really emphasized how even in that moment, cannibalism was absolutely widespread, because, I wonder if you insert the precision that Father Ripperger does, whether cannibalism is the right qualifying term there, because if it's all that was available to them, like, that's what some people did to survive. And we don't get to sit here and wonder, like, what level will the chastisement that God might have in store for mankind look like? Is it going to be so bad that that's the kind of situation that you might be looking at? We don't know.
Hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but I guess it's interesting thought experiment to think about, and to discuss what those options might be. I know for me, I've had hard conversations with my kids when they see me prepping and they're asking questions about some of these things. What would we do in some of these situations? And I've had to talk to them about we want to help, but there's situations where we wouldn't be able to help everybody who might need help in, these types of scenarios. But I know, and I talked about this in my prepping video I made on food storage. We try to say, okay, we can't help everybody, but we are gonna put some food aside specifically for the person who knocks at the door who says, hey, I didn't prep. Do you have something? Okay, yeah, I can't give you 100 pounds of food, but I can give you food for today. Maybe this will hold you over until you find your next meal, your next, something. So we can try to help in some way or whatever. But I mean, yeah, maybe that's something for people, when you're first getting started prepping, maybe people are only just putting back those immediate bare necessities for their family. But then maybe the next year, the year after, maybe they're upgrading to the next level of better flashlight or better food storage option or better water filter. Okay, well, what do you do with the old one? Well, don't throw it out. Maybe put that in your prepping tithing box that you can then share with other people. As they need something, you can offer them something maybe in those type of situations. So I mean, yeah, it's interesting to think about where that line would be. In that moment, right, you're going to have to gauge how many people do you have entrusted to your immediate care, how much supplies do you have, how many people need help, and navigate that the best you can in the moment. But yeah, trying to find that balance between just being cold and unassistive, but also knowing to take care of your family first. It's a tough one to walk through sometimes.
It is, and at the end of the day, the principle at play here is the principle of subsidiarity and the law of proximity, right? So the principle of subsidiarity is, you work at the local grassroots level. Government policy should be in accordance with the local needs, the local standards, the local customs, and the law of proximity, dictates that you need to care the most hierarchically about what you're responsible for in your state in life. And as husbands and fathers, that means your wife is number one, your children are number two, and it has to be in that order in order to maintain the unity at the spouse level to be able to serve the children. And then your family, and then it just depends on your specific circumstance, right? Like, I mean, people who are in an urban setting are going to have some tough times if there's a mass level event. People who are in the rural area are going to be in a much better situation. So again, this is all going to depend. That fantasy, thought experiment setting in Twilight Zone was much more like close knit, like a suburban or an urban scenario than like Homestead, this movie, which looks like it's more on a rural level. So you're going to have to adapt depending on that. But your next door neighbors, and whatever that looks like for you, are kind of like next in line after family and friends. And so it's all about that proximity, and it really is just a prudential thing. It's like, okay, am I going to mean well by helping this person, but then all of a sudden they're going to attach or latch onto us or come back later in the night because I decided to help them. It kind of reminds me of when people get into conversations about offering money to the homeless on the street. Like I do it all the time, but I also have the luxury of being a big guy. I'm not worried about somebody turning the tables on me. Somebody who might be, like a woman or someone else might, need to have other considerations when they're doing that. But there's like layers of how you can help them, empathetically, while also being cognizant that the money might be used for the wrong things. You can use a gift card. You can actually go to the restaurant together. Right. So it's the same thing in one of these extreme situations where you have to make a prudential decision on the fly, but then also think ahead about what else could happen as a result of this. And am I able to maintain the baseline considerations of what I'm actually responsible for?
And that's a good segue to the next moral dilemma or objection that I was going to bring up today. So let's suppose some people say, well, you mentioned earlier food, water, medical, shelter, and security. So, some Christians are going to kind of maybe be taken aback when we talk about security and we say, okay, what about when people come to the door and they're not just asking for assistance, they're demanding assistance, and they, maybe it's not just one person there with a friendly smile. Maybe it's 3, 4 guys and they have weapons and they want in because they heard you have supplies. So when we're talking about security and the possibility of even having to use force to defend your family, to defend the supplies you have for your family, how do we square this with Catholic theology when we talk about having to possibly use force in that way?
Sure. And I mean, I guess the good news is since I already broached the cannibalism subject, this is easy comparatively. Because of course you look at the fifth commandment, right? Thou shalt not murder. And we as Catholics recognize that just war doctrine is just that. It's a doctrine of our faith. It's part of what we believe. And so, and listen, I say this as somebody who, every time I watch The Passion of the Christ, we tend to do like an annual devotion on Good Friday with that. It's just an absolute masterpiece. I get choked up at the very beginning when, Peter, the chief apostle, goes and cuts off the soldier's ear for accosting our Lord. And Peter was absolutely within his right there. And yet even then, Jesus was like, he who kills by the sword dies by the sword, and performs the miracle of healing the ear there. So there's like the natural version of what we are allowed to do. And then there's that supernatural version of like, the saints are just at a level of holiness where they have such an aura that there might be something really weird that happens in that specific scenario where God's, justice or magnificence will be revealed in a profoundly unexpected way. So I just share that to say, we'll touch on what's allowed, but I would always also allow for that divine X factor.
Well, that's
So
interesting though. So let me, if you don't mind, I'll interrupt you for a
please.
second there. So thinking about allowed versus saying, hey, maybe some of the saints laid down their life, even if they would have been permitted theologically to defend it. That's interesting because, some people who have an aversion to use of force, they might say, and because they might perceive it as a more noble position to say, well, if somebody comes to my house, I'm just going to, lay down my life if I'm called to, whatever. And if somebody is living by themselves and they're making the decision just for themselves, that might be a heroically virtuous choice they might decide to make. But if you're a father with children and a wife entrusted to your care, is it the virtuous decision to make to say, well, if the marauders come to my house, I'll just lay down my life, and if they have their way with my wife and children and whatever else, well, I was just being virtuous. Is that more virtuous, or are we actually
Absolutely
called
not.
to defend and say, I have a duty here to use force to protect my wife and children?
I'm so glad you drew that distinction, because that's exactly where I was going with it.
Okay.
It all depend. This is back to prudence, which is knowing the right thing to do pertaining to the circumstances. Obviously, we're husbands and fathers, so we often come from that particular bent. But I'm also trying to lay down the universal groundwork for whatever state of life that somebody is in. If you happen to be in our state of life, you are actually duty bound to eliminate that threat, because you are responsible for your wife and for your children. And I made a joke earlier with the trailer that women are the heart, and I firmly believe that men are the head and women are the heart. We also need to acknowledge what happened in the Garden of Eden. Like the curse of Adam is that he's a coward, particularly in relationship to women, because he doesn't exercise his headship, right? Because he allowed Eve to to fool him. And then the curse of Eve that all women suffer from is this desire, this unmoderated, this vicious desire to control, and particularly to control men. And neither of those are going to work in a survival situation, just like they don't work now. So, when the woman was like, well, what are we really doing here? It's like, I don't know. I haven't seen the full movie. She might be dead on point and really speaking to their conscience, and that's a good thing. She could also have been dead wrong in that situation in terms of if that's happening in real life, depending on who that woman is in relationship to that man. Because the principles that we've been laying down in this episode are what need to prevail, and that's a purely rational endeavor. It's not to be guided by emotions. So when you're dealing with that situation where your wife and your children safety are on the line, as a man, as the head, as the leader, you have a responsibility in that circumstance to eliminate the threat.
Yeah, very good. So speaking of another common objection that I think could be related to your state in life that could, play into the answer here. What do we say to people who say, well, doesn't, the end of Matthew chapter 6 just call us to trust in God, to not worry about food and drink, and to just, put our trust in him and he will provide for us. So, I'm not going to take all these extra steps to store stuff. I'm just going to trust God and he'll provide. Well, what would you say to somebody who objects to prepping on those grounds?
Yeah, I would say if we didn't say this earlier, but hopefully one of the top things on your list of spiritual goods to pack in your go bag is a Bible. I'd say make sure it's a Bible with a good Catholic concordance. Because otherwise, that's an example of a purely Protestant understanding of sacred scripture, where you hyper focus on one specific verse and you're like, I think this is what this means. But we, of course, as Catholics, come to realize Jesus was in that context specifically talking to his apostles, who he was setting forth on a specific mission. So that particular advice doesn't necessarily apply to just anybody in all times and all circumstances, because again, how do you shore that up with, if you don't work or prep, you don't eat, right? You don't get to have the energy that comes with the hard work that was put into this situation, right? So that doesn't mean just, don't prepare and just let go and let God with all the circumstances. No, he was referring to his apostles there, and he was doing that because they had a specific commission, and coming as they were to the different towns and having that litmus test of figuring out who was going to receive them, who was going to accept them, and who was going to reject them, where they had to take their piece back, dust off their sandals and move on. He was setting up the parameters for that particular mission there.
So it sounds kind of like we were saying for the state in life of a father who's called to defend his family and protect them physically from threats. Again, if you're a provider for your family, your state in life requires a certain kind of preparation that maybe if somebody who is living as a religious or has a particular call where you're going out, like the apostles were, that state in life might afford a different kind of situation. And so, which verses guide you in those different situations could apply differently. So, yeah.
Right. 100%.
Very good. All right. So as we start to move towards wrapping up here, so if we think of coming out of this discussion, suppose somebody's watching this and they're considering prepping for the first time. They've heard everything we've talked about today, and they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And if we said, okay, we want to just give, 2 or 3 simple measurable steps that they can kind of just start with to get started on this journey of prepping. What would you recommend to someone who's just getting started and want to give them some place to start without feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say prioritize your spirituality, number one. And, for me, I had mentioned how I was kind of attuned to these ideas pretty early in life. I also, before I ended up having that adult conversion experience, suffered from a lot of anxiety. And, I thought, oh, the world is potentially ending. I was kind of caught up in that 2012 garbage, for a minute there. And, if you're going into it with that frame of mind, you're doing it wrong. So that's why I would say, that's what I would have done differently, by the way. I would have shored up the spiritual aspect first, because it gives you the right lens through which to manage everything else. Once I found out that those Jesuits in Japan survived a kilometer from the epicenter of the atom bomb, because they attributed this, when the journalists were like, how is this possible? They were like, because we lived the message of Fatima daily. And theologians have parsed that out, saying they prayed the rosary every single day. So those are the things spiritually that you want to shore up first. You want to have a healthy relationship to this overall concept. You need to come to realize that with God, nothing is impossible. And my goodness, if nothing else, if you've got fire insurance because you're, managing all of the spiritual expectations that we have, those 5 precepts of the church, to fulfill justice, but then maximize your stats, get to the charity level. I mean, obviously it's tongue in cheek, because you're going to reach a point of relationship with the Lord to where it's not really selfish anymore, and you're doing it for the right reasons. Maybe he will protect you even from a nuke. It's happened before. And that really just level sets who's in charge, and what is my relationship to this overall dynamic. Then for number 2, I would say, obviously do shore up the physical aspect. Just figure out between, food, water, shelter, medical and defense, or security, where your strengths are, what comes naturally, where your weaknesses are, but have at least a baseline level of understanding of all of those, because you need the whole package in order to survive. Hopefully, with an end towards thriving. And then number 3 is, for those inevitable areas where it's just like, yeah, that's not my jam. Factor that into your relationships with other people. You need to have, like in life, we should have like a short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategy. And, so too, if you're going to spend this energy on this endeavor, make it light, make it fun, make it work for you. If you got a family, particularly a young family, we need to find a way. You don't just go, oh, cannibalism, and joking about eating on someone's thighs. Obviously that's an adult joke, but you find a way to explain to your kids, why are we talking about, if the grid goes down and our phones aren't working, this is our location that we might go to. We might have other people that are involved that will meet us there. If we don't see them in X amount of time, we have to retreat to this location with the end of, getting somewhere rural or whatever that looks like. The point is that get involved with your community, with your trusted community, because you're not going to, no one's Rambo here, you're not going to go it alone. This isn't the movies. And then a final thing I would say on all of it is, again, just make sure that you lead with the spiritual and religious component, because whatever might be coming down the pipe, if we actually study those Marian approved apparitions, and we hear about this chastisement that's coming, COVID showed us that all the preparation in the world is not truly going to prepare you for what might actually happen. And that's why you need to ultimately have trust in the Lord, and allow for that in the evolution, if you will, of the game plan, because at the end of the day, he's in charge.
Absolutely. And so for those people who are watching this and maybe saying, you know what, I have done some prepping, but maybe those spiritual preps aren't quite up to where they should be now that I've, reflected on some of this, and maybe they want to take those next steps to grow closer to our Lord, to improve their spiritual health. And if maybe they want to learn more about, measurable steps they can take to do that, do you want to share with the viewers a little bit about your Catholic holistic coaching and how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called Rich Dawn Life Coaching. When I started my YouTube channel, it's under my namesake currently, as you can see here. And the name of my podcast is called The Rich Dawn, where eternal beatitude begins in this life. And for those who want to dive deeper, you can learn all about my conversational style, philosophy, frameworks, and everything with the litany of episodes that are available there. And then if you head over to therichdawN.com, that's THERICHDAWN.com. Think of like a beautiful morning, right? Like, describe a life that you would truly love to live, where you wake up in the morning, you're looking at the Rich Dawn and you just want to crush it in life, you can feel free to sign up. I've got a calendar on there to take up a slot for some Catholic life coaching.
Very good. And I'll put links in the show notes to your YouTube channel and to the Rich Dawn as well, so people can get there easily. But Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. We've been so blessed to hear your insights and your life experiences there and everything you've shared with us today. So just thank you so much for being with me today and for this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for all the good you're doing for God's kingdom on earth as well, John. God bless you.
You too, Kyle. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon. And for those watching, thank you for joining us today. And let me know your best spiritual preparedness tip in the comments below. And if there are any other topics you'd like me to see me bring guests on to discuss in the future. Also, if you found this video helpful, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might benefit from it as well. It really does help out me and the channel. And don't forget to follow the Barricade Guard on Facebook, X, and Instagram. The links are in the show notes below. And until next time, fortify your soul, body, and family.